Thank you for joining us here today, both those watching from home or work and those who've been able to be in the room with us. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Joseph Mikett. I'm the newly appointed director of the Energy Security and Climate Change program here at CSIS. And I look forward to getting to know you all better over the coming days, months, and years. This morning we have a very exciting program, so I don't want to drone on too long. The only thing I'll note is we're happy to host this as a hybrid event. We've got a few people here in the room with us, a vaccinated facility here at CSIS, but we're very happy that you're all able to join us. We hope we provide a safe and comfortable environment for a spirited and engaging discussion. While you're here, we are not anticipating a fire drill or any other emergency event, but should one arise, you'll see the emergency exits at the sides and the flank of the building. If something happens, please follow the instructions of a CSIS employee. Otherwise, welcome, and thank you for joining us. We're joined today by Charif Souki for what I hope is a really great conversation. He's the chairman of Tellurian Company, former founder and CEO of Cheniere Energy, decades of experience in gas, and decades spent thinking about how we can meet the energy needs of the world while also paying attention to the risks of climate change. Those are the two of the biggest challenges we face. They're what our energy program thinks about every day. And rather than go on and on, I will introduce my colleague, Nikos Safos, to lead us in discussion. If you've got questions, those in the room may use the QR codes at your seat to submit them. They go directly to Nikos. And if you're watching from online, we have tools available there as well. So thank you for joining us, and here's to a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you all for being here in the room, and thank you everyone from watching from home. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm thrilled to have Charif back at CSIS to talk about the role of US LNG in the energy transition. So much to talk about, Charif, but I can't resist. We have to start maybe from the current moment. Gas prices are, I think the technical term is insane. These past few months, we've seen prices both here in the US and in Europe and in Asia go up. We've seen electricity prices in Europe go up. We've seen carbon prices go up. You know, we'll talk a little bit about what all that means for a project developer like yourself, but maybe just start by how do you read the data? What is really happening? What are the prices telling us? How are you understanding this current moment in gas markets?
Well, the first thing I would say is it was all predictable. This should not be a surprise from anybody. Just fundamentally, if you invest in supply, you're going to be in a good position. And if you don't invest in supply, then you run the risk that demand doesn't do what you expected it to do, and then all of a sudden you have a problem. We have been lulled by a period of low prices everywhere, not just for natural gas, but for energy in general. And we became complacent. We looked at the data with optimism, thinking that things were not going to change. And they did change, and they did change predictably. So we started talking about this over a year ago. And you have to divide the world in two today. You have to look at the United States in its own microcosm, if you will, because we have an enormous amount of energy in the United States. The only limitation for us is infrastructure. If we build the infrastructure, we get energy at a very reasonable price for the rest of the world. So I know gas prices in the US went from $2 an MMBTU a year ago to $6 this morning when I woke up. That sounds like a lot, but historically it's not. $6 an MMBTU is relatively cheap on a historical basis. And especially when you compare it to the rest of the world where prices now are at $25. So from the standpoint of a fundamental position for the United States, we're in a very strong position. Our energy costs a lot less than it does around the rest of the world. And if you migrate to oil, our best-selling car is the Ford Series the F that gets about 12 miles to the gallon, so we really can't complain. Our people don't feel in any kind of crisis given the kind of cars they're driving. So we have a lot of room here. We're the world's largest oil producer, the world's largest gas producer, the top 2 gas exporters, and very, very important to the oil trade on a global basis. So the difference from 5 years ago, if you will, today is what happens in America doesn't just affect America. It affects also the rest of the world because we're a significant piece of the global trade, both for oil and for gas. The rest of the world is in a different situation for natural gas today. You're looking at 3 major producers that will be responsible for the gas that crosses borders in the next decade. Russia, Qatar, and the US. So what happens in those 3 markets is very, very important to the rest of the world. We are in the same position for oil, but instead of Qatar, Saudi Arabia. So we're a very significant part of what happens in the rest of the world. The central question with what is happening now is, what are we going to do about our critical position? Are we going to keep it for ourselves, or are we going to share it with the rest of the world? And for us in the US, it's a function mostly of infrastructure. If we want to make it, I mean, look, high prices are not simply global. California and New England are also suffering from high prices, but that's because they don't want to build the infrastructure. So that's the decision that we have to make today. Are we part of the world economy, or do we want to be isolated?
No, thank you for that. I mean, clearly we are already part of the global market, as you say, and the question is what happens next. So let me then ask, you as a project developer, you're looking at these prices, but you're also, and I would love to hear how you reconcile that. If I look at the price today, I say I should invest more in LNG exports. If I read some of the signals out there about what the energy system should look like in 2040 or 2050, I get a very different signal. How do you reconcile those two, sort of the price signal and the societal political signal that is obviously not as clear, depends on who you talk to, but how do you reconcile those two signals?
And I don't. I'm horrified by the fact that Tellurian is going to make too much money. Because it's politically and societally not acceptable. But I don't know how to get around it. I'm not going to give away half of the profits of the company. I'd get sued by my shareholders. But I'm looking at the delta between American prices and global prices. I do think in the US, we're going to start adding more rigs. In the last 12 months, we added 4 BCF of production. It was absorbed entirely by exports, but exports are now operating at full capacity. So this year, with $5 prices or $6 prices, we'll probably add another 4 or 5 BCF a day, and there's no market for it. So prices will come back down after the winter. We're in a short inventory position. We'll absorb that this winter, and by the spring or the summer, prices will start coming back to normal in the US. The rest of the world, I don't see what the solution is. You are going to rely for gas supplies for the rest of the world on 3 areas. Russia, Qatar, and the US. And I'm looking at everything that is feasible, which, by the way, would not be feasible for at least 5 or 6 years by the time you build the facilities. And I see nothing but catastrophe. I mean, I don't know. Our energy policy on a global basis now is equivalent to a prayer. We are hoping for a warm winter around the world. And that's the energy policy of the world today. So it's kind of disconcerting. And you know what's going to happen? We're going to be called pandemic profiteers or something like this, and I'm horrified at that thought. I would like for the price of gas to be a lot more predictable, a lot less volatile, and that the planning happen on a normal basis in order to avoid this huge volatility. In 1 year, we went from $2.50 gas prices globally to $25 globally. This is just terribly destabilizing.
But what does that tell you about the structure of the market as well? Because, I mean, I think, your point on investment, I mean, I take your point, but in fairness, if you look at the data, because of the lead time, I mean, there's a lot of investment that has happened in recent years that just hasn't shown up yet. I mean, we had a huge boom in final investment decisions in 2019, 2018, even what Qatar is doing. So there is actually a lot of investment. It's just there's always a challenge of when it shows up. And it's not showing up quite yet because it takes time to build the supply. To what extent does that change your calculus in how you think about that? I mean, when Qatar comes out and says, they're going to do their expansion, doesn't that take off a chunk of that potential demand for you?
No. That is, and I'm glad they said that, but they haven't done anything about it yet.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll see when they actually come. They should have come last year or 2 years ago, but they haven't. And you have to go and look at why. That's not my expertise. You have to ask Saad, why haven't you started construction yet? And I'm sure he's got plenty of good reasons. But like everybody else, he's looking for capital, and there's capital allocation, and it was not the right time to do this. Same thing in Russia. They have the gas, they have the resource, the infrastructure is expensive. But if you look at what actually did happen, whether it's LNG Canada or Golden Pass, that happened in 2019, that's not enough. And there's nothing new. I mean, look at how long it took to build the infrastructure in Australia, a very, very long time. So when we're doing our planning in our industry, we need to be thinking in terms of decades. We cannot be thinking in terms of 2 years because we don't have solutions for 2 years. So you look at what is happening, and clearly it was not sufficient because look at where we are, in spite of all the FIDs.
No, fair enough. I mean, I think we've had short-term price shocks quite a few times, right, when the demand spike outpaces the supply spike. And I think that's part of what we're facing today, including some idiosyncratic things like supply being down in a few places like Norway and Trinidad and Nigeria. But I do want to step back a little bit, I think, to the more structural. And I wanted to pick up on something you said about Henry Hub here in the US, and particularly the responsiveness of price to investment. And you talked about the rig count. I mean, we've seen this story of, call it capital discipline, and the sector not really being able to respond to these higher prices. Particularly, that's been a concern, obviously, on the oil side, but obviously it affects the gas side as well. I mean, is that something you're seeing and you're worried about? Like, is the capital just not going to be there for the sector to invest?
No, because in spite of all the rhetoric, capital follows the profit. And if you show that you can run your business profitably,
I think the concern was that they weren't. I think the concern was that they weren't running it. They weren't making a return for investors, and that's why
they were not for a decade.
Yeah.
Yes, and that really is the major driver. So okay, you can have a conscience or not. So you can try to do the right thing, but ultimately that's not what determines whether your corporation is going to survive or not. What it determines whether your corporation survives or not is whether you have a return for your shareholders or not. So capital discipline, it's not surprising, but it really says when prices were low in the US, you shouldn't have drilled. And I can see my colleagues in the industry saying, no, we're going to get out of this. We're going to drill now because we'll benefit later. But the nature of the investments in the US is a little bit different on the upstream side. We don't make investment for 20 years. We make investments for 6 months because it takes about 4 to 5 months to drill a well today in the shale patch. And you get most of your profits in the first 6 months. You produce an enormous amount in the first 6 months. So you have to time it exactly right. This is not like drilling a well that is going to produce the same thing for the next 20 years. This is every 6 months you have to decide whether you continue to drill or not. And we made some bad decisions in this country. We drilled at the time where we shouldn't have. And if all of your profit comes from the first 6 or 12 months of production, timing is extremely important. Then the tail for a shale well doesn't really matter much. So there's good news and bad news in this. You can react extremely quickly. A year ago, we had $1.70 gas prices in the US. The signal was don't drill. A year later, we were at maybe 4 something, right around 4, and 15 months later, we're at 6. So it went that quickly. However, we added 30 rigs to the gas patch. We went from 70 to 100. And in the oil patch, we did significantly better than this, so our associated gas is becoming more important. So now we're faced with a new problem, which is where the long-term policy is so important. We have about a BCF of takeaway left in the Permian Basin, and after that, we're going to be confronted again with flaring or not flaring. Those are the kind of things that we have to start planning for. We can't simply be in front of a situation, okay, we've caught up on the oil side, but we don't know what to do with the gas. And we're getting ready to get in the same problem again. On the gas side, it's much easier because we've added a total production in the last year of about 4 BCF a day. It was completely absorbed by exports, but exports are finished now. So we need to build new export infrastructure. It's going to take 5 years to do so. The next big project is going to be Golden Pass, which is going to be ready towards late 24, early 25. In the meantime, there's no export good news beyond the next 6 months. In the meantime, production in the US will increase by 5 BCF a day because you will see the rig coming in the Haynesville, the rigs are coming in the Permian Basin, and that will be available on the market. So we're not going to have a problem for a very long time.
Let me switch gears a little bit from these dynamics and talk about, you mentioned flaring in the Permian, and so I want to talk a little bit about gas and methane emissions and sustainability. And we've seen carbon neutral, however you define that term, cargoes pop up a lot over the last few months, year. We've seen companies try to reduce the carbon intensity of their LNG production, either through carbon capture and storage, through procurement of low carbon electricity. We're seeing some movement on getting better data and accounting for what the greenhouse gas emissions are for the LNG produced and throughout the value chain. First, what are you doing? How are you interpreting these signals, and what kind of challenge does that pose for you? And how important do you think these kind of measures are for you to be competitive in the marketplace today?
Insignificant.
Insignificant?
Yes.
Explain.
I don't know what a carbon neutral shipment of LNG is. I have no idea. But I do know that LNG contains carbon. So it depends how you define the word carbon neutral. If you mean that you have a source of energy without carbon, then you're talking about hydrogen. We don't know how to use it, produce it, transport it, or anything. So it's very, very early in that process. But I mean, it's a formula. It's C4H. Okay, so if you take the 4 C's and you're left with the H, you're now carbon neutral, but you have hydrogen and you don't know what to do with it. So if you mean that you're simply offsetting your emission, I'm all for it. Do the best you can to go and offset your emission. That means plant trees or do carbon sequestration project or whatever works. And we're very early into that process, so yes, people will cheat and people will abuse the system, but you've got to sort of go through this. When there is confusion, there is an opportunity for abuse. So what you need to do is codify all this, and where it's possible or where it's feasible to do it, then absolutely do it. So we're committed at Tellurian to do that. we will offset our emissions. I don't know that we will be ever carbon neutral. But we committed to do whatever, and we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out what is the best way, whether it's carbon sequestration, whether it's nature-based solutions, or anything else that is possible. So once we agree what the framework was, it's fine. But calling a cargo carbon neutral is nonsensical. And we're talking about 15 cargoes so far. Okay, so big deal.
No, I totally share your criticism of carbon neutral cargoes and how we calculate them. I think, my question is, this is a real thing. Okay, we have both the carbon that comes out from the combustion, but also I think we've had over the last few years a huge amount of uncertainty or questioning of the data we have about methane leaks and sort of the methane leaks along the chain, not just in the US, by the way. I think the numbers or the satellite imagery out of Russia and other places are not looking very good too. And we don't really have a good industry solution to this. I think the industry solution is we're going to innovate, we're going to figure a way out of this, but it doesn't seem to me obvious that the situation's gotten any better.
First, Nikos, on the upstream, methane leaks are inexcusable. They're avoidable. The technology is available to do it. You have 0.2 of 1% that is necessary because it's to deal with emergencies or things that you do not expect. You have to have that as a safety measure. But beyond that 0.2 of 1%, it's inexcusable. So it should not be allowed. Now, it's not always the same on at the industrial side and at the consumption side and transportation side. And we have to make every effort to make sure that those leaks are avoided. So we're 100% in favor of that. That ought to be part of the system.
So down the street, a lot of legislation being discussed these days. One of those things is a methane fee, sort of trying to regulate methane emissions out of the sector. Is that something that you think is wise?
Go ahead, charge it, and let's move on to the next important subject. It's nonsense. It's 10 cents an M. Who cares? Okay? It's just like we have a delta between the US and the rest of the world of $20 an M, and we're worried about 10 cents an M. Just move on. Enough already.
I think we'll quote you on that. Well, some people may quote you on
Oh,
that.
I'm sure somebody will say, did you say that? Yes, I did.
No, but I mean, I think the broader point, which I think this question of emissions along the chain and the infrastructure that we have for measuring them and making sure that we keep everyone honest, I mean, that's still kind of like a little bit like the Wild West. I mean, we don't have very good data and information. I mean, do you feel comfortable about the gas that you'll be producing and sourcing and your competitors? And how comfortable are you feeling that you know the carbon intensity of your production and that of your competitors?
Look, it's an important topic, and we're looking at it very seriously. We understand the carbon intensity of our process. We know exactly within range how much we're going to be responsible for and how much CO2 we're going to emit. And we're looking for solutions in order to offset that. Now, to tell you that we can do it at the plant with today's environment and today's policies and permits, we can't. Yeah. Okay. However, are there solutions that we can look at in order to offset the emissions that we are emitting? Absolutely, and we're looking very seriously. And in good time, when we know that we're doing something that is reasonable and effective and measurable, we'll make the announcement of what it is. It will not be a carbon neutral cargo, promise you. Okay, but it will be something consequent, and that makes a difference. The fundamental problem is not this. The fundamental problem, before we get down in the details and look at all the small details, is that 15% of the world's population is using 40% of the world's energy. And the rest of the world, the other 85%, who happen not to be OECD countries, want to catch up. And that is irreversible. Their sense of what is existential is not the same as our sense of what is existential. Their sense is what happens next week, not what happens 30 years from today. And just to let them get to half of our living standards requires 100 million barrels of oil equivalent. And I don't know what the time frame is, whether it's 5 years or 30 years. But I bet you that you're going to ask them, and they tell you next year, not 30 years from today. We want our people to drive. We want our people to heat their homes. We want our people to turn the lights on. We want to be able to afford our fertilizers so that we can make food for our people. Those are their existential issues. And since 80% of the world energy is hydrocarbon, I don't see how you give them what they want without hydrocarbons.
Hold that thought. I'm going to come back to it, but I did want to.
Please do.
I shall. I do want to, because you mentioned policy, and I did want to do one more follow-up. There are two sort of massive pieces of legislation being negotiated in this town. First, a more general, what are you looking at? What do you think is consequential? What matters? And maybe more specifically, you're here in Washington. What are you lobbying for? You already gave me your thoughts on the methane fee. We may have a carbon price on the table. You've spoken in the past about the role of carbon pricing. But maybe more broadly, what are you seeing? What are you pushing for? And then maybe a specific comment on carbon pricing.
Well, first, I am all in favor of the infrastructure bill. However, it's just the beginning. If we think this is the end of the infrastructure investment that we need in this country, we're delusional. We're going to need, first we're going to need to choose our energy source, because we're talking about electrification, but electricity is not the primary source. So you have to decide what it is that you want for your electricity. And if you get it wrong, you end up being it's amazing because it's diametrically opposed political systems in California and in Texas with the same issue, dysfunctional grids. So you can't say that one side is more apt to deal with the issue than the other side, because they're both making a total mess of their infrastructure. So you look at this and you say, okay, I'm going to fall short, and it's going to be translated in the United States, not by prices, but by unreliable grids. Nikos, as you know, I grew up in Lebanon. I'm used to having interruptible electricity. I didn't think I would come to America to find the same thing. But I don't think Americans are going to accept having unreliable services. So when you do it once, twice, 3 times, and you can't rely on the grid for your electrification, you're going to say, fine, I'm going to buy my own generator, or I'm going to make sure that the subdivision in which I live has its own generator, and I'm not going to rely on the grid anymore to supply me my electricity. So fundamentally, if you really want to address that issue that we're using more electricity for everything, and we haven't even started with EVs yet, then we're going to have to rethink our grid. And if we think we're going to do it for $1.5 trillion, we need to re-examine everything. So do I do this for Tellurian? No, I don't care for Tellurian. But as an American citizen, yes, I care, because we're heading towards very dysfunctional states of affairs. So carbon tax, I've been advocating for a carbon tax for 10 years, not very successfully so far. But I think if you want to manage demand, that's one way of doing it, which is important, and which kind of puts everything back in equilibrium. There's advantages, there's disadvantages, but at the end of the day, if you really think that climate change is an existential threat, then the only way you can do this is by increasing the cost of the carbon in the energy mix. And if you don't want to acknowledge this, then you're never going to be successful. Going around saying that non-hydrocarbon energy sources are cheaper is just wrong. It's not true. So you have three different issues. The first one is, where's your supply chain? We don't control it. We cannot duplicate it in this country because it involves mining. We will never do the mining at the scale that is necessary in this country. The second thing is location. You find very quickly that if you want to put solar panels or windmills in a neighborhood, you start getting some objections very quickly. So the low-hanging fruit is gone. We're now going to difficult places. Generally speaking, you can still find the places where you can do it. And then thirdly, transmission. Once the wind blows in certain parts, the sun shines in certain parts, and if you want to transmit that electricity to the rest of the country, the transmission grid by itself is significantly larger than $1.5 trillion. So the infrastructure bill is great, but it's just the beginning. So if we're serious about electrifying the United States, then we need to take a look at what it really implies and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. And I think the best way to do it today is to have a price on carbon.
Let me do one more on this topic. I want to continue that thread of electrification. The president has a target of carbon-free electricity by 2035, 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030. To get to that number, if you do any simple math, you have to really sharply reduce the use of gas in the electricity sector. How do you think about that transition in the electricity system?
That's not an energy policy. That's a prayer. Go to church, pray for whatever you want.
But there's some money backing the prayer, at least in legislation.
Yeah, and you have to ask whether the money goes for the priest or for the bishop or for... So we're not talking about scale that makes a difference. Your priest and your church are going to be fine. The rest of the village, I'm not so sure.
I'll have to think about what that means, the priest and the village.
We're not going to get there. It's unrealistic. So you can aspire to whatever you want. At some point, reality is going to hit you in the face. Which, ask the Europeans.
Yeah, let's talk about that, though. Because
Yeah.
I think the challenge, and you talked about earlier, the need of the developing world. Gas hasn't done very well in the developing world. Gas has really struggled to compete. We've seen a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that once their domestic gas resources got depleted, they turned to coal. We are still relying so much on China for the incremental gas demand, and China is essentially losing money on imports. So I appreciate the sort of desire to provide energy. I think that's an important goal. But the reality is that gas has really struggled to compete, especially against coal, and increasingly against renewables, by the way. You look at Europe, the place that has gone furthest in deploying renewable energy, it's really hit gas. I think the story that gas and renewables would work together sort of hasn't really panned out. So I threw two things at you. Go ahead. You're smiling already, so go ahead.
Well, I think Europe is not a very good example right now because maybe gas hasn't done very well so far in Europe. But what are they asking for? They're asking Russia to please send me more gas, and they turning to the Biden administration and said, when can we count on your LNG? So it's not a question of what we want to do for them. It's a question of what they want, whether you're talking about Europe or the rest of the world. So gas hasn't done very well because occasionally it's become very expensive.
Okay.
So when it's expensive, look at Bangladesh. They're moving to oil, to fuel for their power generation capacity because they can't afford $25 an M for natural gas. So are you telling me that gas is not doing well, or is gas doing too well? Because the guy who's producing the gas and selling at $25 is not complaining.
He's not, but if you're trying to tell me that this is a contribution to
No, it's not.
energy
No,
and
I
economic
never
development.
Said,
yeah,
no,
okay.
Nikos. I never said that.
Okay.
We start by being capitalists. Okay, we are concerned by making money, not by anything else.
Okay.
Okay, I may have a social conscience, I may have the willingness to do something, but my first responsibility is to make money for my shareholders and for myself. So let's not be hypocritical about this. Then after that, if I've made enough money, I may have a conscience that says, take some of that money and reinvest it for something that benefits the world. And I'm all for that. And I think that if you start making too much money, it's not natural. You got to be in a position where you give back some of what you've made. I don't think all my shareholders would agree with me. So I can do it on a personal basis. I cannot do it for my corporation. So let's start with, we are motivated by profit. And when you tell me gas is not doing well, when the world gas price is $25, I don't know what you're talking about. We're doing extremely well.
Let me rephrase then. You told us that 50% of the world's people consume 40% of the world's energy. There's a billion people, a little bit less, although increased with COVID, without access to electricity. We have huge parts of the world that have access to electricity, but only because we define access in a super low number. If we have a real number, that share of population is much greater. So that is a real challenge.
Yes.
What I'm trying to figure out is, I've been in the gas business in one way or another for about 15 years. I haven't really seen gas do well to address that challenge. I haven't really seen gas do well in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah.
I haven't seen gas do well in Southeast Asia. I see gas doing well in the Chinese because they're willing to subsidize the imports.
Okay, so your definition of do well.
Consumption. Use gas.
So we gave them an opportunity, as you know, to come and actually own gas resources that would have made their gas affordable for the next 30 or 40 years. Based on a resource, and I told you before, Russia, Qatar, US. Russia, Qatar, good luck owning the resource. The only place where you can do that in the US. We went around the world telling people, you should own American gas because you can have it for $5 or $6 an MMBTU for the next 30 or 40 years. And you saw how well we did with this. So we're back now to a situation where we're an American producer and we're going to sell you the gas at the highest possible price. So from a standpoint of a US producer, gas is doing extremely well. From a standpoint of a developing country needing energy to continue their development, they're stuck. They have coal or gas. They have nothing else. So they're sitting there and say, okay, I'll build all the windmills you will finance for me if you're willing to. But it won't make a difference in my energy use and my energy consumption. I really need, well, today oil makes sense, but it won't make sense for very long because next year oil will be following gas with the pricing. We need coal or gas to give us the energy that we need. Those are our two choices, unless you're willing to start building nuclear plants in my country, which is not likely. So you look at the situation today. For 85% of the world's population, the choice is extremely simple: coal or gas. So if we really are looking at an emission problem and a climate issue that is going to be coming to a crisis in 30 years, encouraging the rest of the world to go to coal instead of gas is not very consistent with the existential threat of climate change. You can do whatever you want in Europe and the US. If 85% of the world is not following, you haven't accomplished anything.
You said if you're a developing country, your choice is gas on coal or coal. And I think a few people would say, or renewables, but you didn't say that. You don't think that gas is competing with renewables?
Renewables on a global basis represents 5% of the energy mix. So grow it to whatever you want. It's not going to be sufficient. Multiply it by 4. Go to 20% of the energy mix. Okay, you haven't done anything. So the energy consumption is going to continue to increase. So today, hydrocarbons is 80% of the energy mix. 30 years from now, it'll be 75%. Would have made some progress in terms of percentage, but in absolute terms, hydrocarbons will have increased. Which, by the way, we went from biomass to coal in the 1850s. We still consume more biomass today than we did in 1850. So this whole notion of transition is a non-starter. There is no transition, there's evolution. You move from one energy source to the next one. It doesn't mean you stop with the old one.
Yeah, that's true until it isn't, though, right?
I bet you that
I mean, the coal transition, the coal people would tell you that the coal transition in the U.S. was a transition. They got hammered. Coal use declined, 60%.
I didn't say there's not victims at every step of the way. You just have to pick your horses and decide if you're going to have the right horse or the wrong horse. And that's what I'm doing. I mean, if somebody convinced me that I could build windmills without subsidies and profitably, I would be doing that. I'm not married to natural gas. I didn't grow up in Texas. For me, I looked at a sector that looked completely underinvested, and I said, eventually, if this sector is underinvested, it's going to benefit because it's something that is needed. So, but if somebody could show me the same thing about solar panels or windmills, I'd be building windmills.
Maybe one day you will. We'll have you
I'm
back.
Kind of getting towards the end of my career here, Nikos. I keep delaying my retirement, but
the economics are looking pretty good. Let me do one final question. We're kind of running out of time. And by the way, thank you for your questions. I've integrated as much as I can here. I wanted to benefit from your long experience in this sector. About 10 years ago, you were putting the final touches on Sabine Pass and getting the sort of first export projects from the lower 48.
Exactly 6 years ago.
Exactly 6 years
5 years ago, actually. And
But
final touches.
The final touches before construction, I mean.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The final touches before you could.
You're exactly right. We started construction in 2012.
I know. Yeah. I know my math. You're out there still selling LNG. What's different in the world? I mean, is it all the same structurally, plus or minus, or is there a real difference in the world that you're seeing today?
No, of course there's a difference. I mean, first, the LNG has become a true commodity. So the business model that you had 5 years ago, 10 years ago is no longer valid. Second, America has become a very significant part of the global trade, the global gas trade. We're responsible today for close to 20% of the natural gas that actually crosses borders. So if you take out American gas for America, Russian gas for Russia, so on and so forth, we're 20% of the world trade. So we're a very important factor in pricing gas on a global basis. The world cannot live without American LNG today. So if you do that, $25 would look cheap. You'll go to $50. You can't take 20% of the supply out without having a significant impact on prices. The arbitrage between US and global gas is going to continue to stay there because we have an enormous resource. We've got 50, 60, 70 years worth of resource. And both for domestic consumption and for exports. The issue is going to be infrastructure. So our business model had to evolve over the last decade from something that was transitioned from point to point to a more of an open market. That has succeeded. It is now 30 or 40% of the trade is now in the spot market. And you're developing some indices on a global basis that are becoming just as reliable as Henry Hub. So you have JKM in Asia, and you have TTF in Europe, and you have some sub-indices related. So the Indians have decided to have an India market, so now we have WIM, and you have an English market, so you have NBP. So, but it's all correlated by transportation, unless there is a break in the supply chain. So this is the world that we live in today, and the resource today is in the United States, and the optimal way of pursuing this is to own the American resource and to sell it on the market globally at the highest possible price, because the barrier is the infrastructure. And believe it or not, for a country with our coastline, the number of sites that actually work is very limited. So if you find one, you have something very special.
And on that note, I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you, of course, to Charif. The ability to disagree civilly is one of the things I admire most about Charif, and I always love hearing his perspective. So please, for those in the room, please join me in a round of applause for Charif. And for everyone at home or at work, thank you so much for tuning in.